Our community is one of those exclusive, gated enclaves where the HOA rules are as ironclad as they are absurd. Every little detail, from the color of your mailbox to the angle of your hedges, is regulated with military precision, and heaven help you if you dare to deviate. It's a place where conformity is worshipped, and anyone who questions the rules is treated like a criminal against suburban perfection. Now, allow me to introduce the key players in this drama. First, there's me, a retired Navy SEAL, a man who's seen more in the line of duty than most will ever dream of. I've got scars and stories to prove it, and while I may carry the weight of a heroic past, it's my role as a father that truly defines me. My experiences in the Navy taught me discipline, respect, and a commitment to protecting the people I care about, no matter what. And that's exactly why I'm here, in the midst of this suffocating suburban circus, standing up for what's right. Then, there's my son, a sweet, kind-hearted kid who, despite his physical disabilities, has a spirit so bright it could light up this otherwise drab neighborhood. He's the kind of child who sees the best in people, even when the world seems determined to remind him that he's different. Every day, he faces the silent cruelty of subtle stares, whispered judgments, and sometimes even blatant acts of prejudice. But he remains unbroken, a beacon of resilience in a community that prides itself on its facade of perfection while harboring a toxic undercurrent of elitism. And now, let me introduce the antagonist of our tale, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman who's earned her nickname Karen through years of holier-than-thou behavior. Karen struts around the neighborhood like she's the arbiter of all things proper and polite, armed with a clipboard and a list of rules that she enforces with an iron fist. In her mind, she's the guardian of our community's standards, a necessary evil keeping our suburban utopia from descending into chaos. But trust me when I say, her idea of order is nothing more than a tool for bullying and controlling her neighbors. Every interaction with her is a reminder of how some people wield power not to help others, but to feel superior. It was inevitable that these worlds would collide. On one particularly sweltering afternoon, as I was tending to my garden, a small, quiet act of defiance in a neighborhood where every blade of grass must be perfectly manicured, I heard a commotion near the community center. Curiosity piqued. I walked over, only to find a group of residents clustered around a scene that would soon become the spark for a full-blown suburban uprising. There, in the center of the chaos, was Karen herself, mid-rant and red-faced, confronting my son. I could barely believe my eyes when I saw her, in all her self-righteous glory, sneer and spit at my kiddo as if he were some unsightly blemish on our pristine community. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated contempt, a reminder that entitlement knows no bounds. I stood there, a mix of rage and disbelief coursing through my veins, recalling my days in the Navy where I learned that discipline and respect are non-negotiable. The sight of my son, who has always been my reason to fight and protect, being so utterly disrespected by someone who was supposed to be a pillar of our community, lit a fire in me that could not be contained. In that moment, I realized that beneath the veneer of neighborhood civility, there existed a raw, festering injustice that demanded to be addressed. This introduction isn't just a recounting of events. It's a call to arms for anyone who's ever been marginalized by those who think the rules apply only to the lesser among us. My son's dignity, the values I hold dear from my time in service, and the very essence of fairness in our community were all on the line. And let me tell you, nothing in my past as a Navy SEAL prepared me for the kind of petty tyranny I was about to confront in my own backyard. As you can see, our little suburban paradise is anything but perfect. It's a battleground where the old world of honor clashes with the modern-day absurdity of bureaucratic oppression. And while Karen and her ilk might fancy themselves as the custodians of tradition, they've forgotten one crucial lesson. True leadership is not about enforcing rules for the sake of control, but about standing up for what's right, even when it means taking on the most entitled among us. Let me tell you, nothing quite rattles your sense of injustice like witnessing a power trip go off in real time, and that fateful HOA meeting was one for the books. Picture this: a sweltering summer evening, the community center's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and a room full of well-dressed neighbors nervously shifting in their seats. Everyone knew something was about to go down, but none of us could have predicted the magnitude of the absurdity that was about to be unleashed. As the meeting kicked off, Karen, the self-proclaimed arbiter of neighborhood perfection, took center stage. Clad in her signature pastel blazer and armed with a clipboard that she treated like the holy grail of suburban decorum, she began her tirade. Her voice, dripping with condescension, recited rule after rule as if she were reciting a sacred text. And I could see the tension in the room build with every syllable she uttered, like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. The turning point came when Karen's eyes locked onto my son. I swear, the disdain in her gaze could curdle milk. Without any provocation other than his mere presence and his physical differences, she launched into a scathing monologue about maintaining the standards of our community and how deviations from the norm disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic. And then, as if scripted by a deranged playwright, she did the unthinkable. She spat. Not just a casual, dismissive spit, but a full-blown projectile of contempt aimed directly at my son, targeting his disability in a display of sheer malice. I remember the room falling deathly silent. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and every eye shifted toward the unfolding debacle. Some residents sat frozen, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort, while others fidgeted, clearly torn between wanting to intervene and fearing the repercussions of rocking the boat in our tightly controlled suburban society. It was as if everyone was silently praying that the scene would end quickly, even though it was clear that Karen's behavior was anything but fleeting. Inside, my anger was a maelstrom. Memories of my time in the Navy flooded back. Days spent in high-stakes, life-or-death situations where discipline and respect were paramount. I'd been trained to handle chaos, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to never back down when injustice reared its ugly head. But nothing in those grueling drills prepared me for the gut-wrenching violation of my son's dignity, committed in the name of maintaining some warped version of community standards. My mind raced through every lesson I'd ever learned about loyalty and honor. I recalled the countless hours of training, the sacrifices made, and the unwavering commitment to protecting those I cared about. And in that moment, I realized that Karen's actions were not just a personal affront. They were a symbolic attack on everything I held dear. The rules she parroted so relentlessly were nothing more than a smokescreen, a way to cover up her own insecurities and assert her misguided sense of superiority over others. But it wasn't just me who felt the sting. The silent witnesses in the room, our neighbors, were grappling with their own inner conflicts. Some of them had endured Karen's overbearing tyranny for years, and while they might have kept their heads down, the image of her spewing venom at an innocent child sparked something inside them. Whispers began circulating among the crowd, hushed conversations that carried both sympathy for my son and a growing resentment toward the system that allowed such behavior to persist. It was a stark reminder that beneath the veneer of our perfect neighborhood, discontent and dissent were simmering just below the surface. I could feel the weight of every unspoken word, every disappointed gaze directed at me. I knew I couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by a mix of fury and disbelief. But at the same time, I was acutely aware of the fragile line I was about to cross. A line that separated calm, measured resolve from the raw, unfiltered force of a man pushed too far. The silent majority in that room was waiting for a spark, a sign that someone would stand up against this tyranny of entitlement. And in that moment, I realized that my internal battle was more than just a personal vendetta. It was a call to arms for every single person who'd ever been humiliated or belittled by the self-appointed rulers of our suburban universe. That meeting, which began as a mundane assembly to review trivial neighborhood issues, transformed into a battleground for dignity and respect. The energy in the room shifted palpably as Karen's behavior reached its peak. A peak that, in a twisted way, illuminated the very real cracks in the facade of our community's order. In her desperate bid to maintain control, she had inadvertently exposed the deep-seated inequities that had long been tolerated under the guise of tradition. So, as I stood there, my blood boiling and my resolve hardening, I made a silent vow. This would not stand. I wouldn't allow Karen or anyone else to demean my son, to tarnish his spirit with their baseless prejudice. The principles I learned from years of service, courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice were about to be put to the test. And trust me when I say, I wasn't about to let this injustice go unanswered. In that charged moment of confrontation, as the room braced for what would inevitably come next, it became painfully clear. This wasn't just about a spit. It was about every time someone had been made to feel less than human by the crushing weight of entitlement and bigotry. And it was about finally, unequivocally saying enough is enough. I knew things couldn't go on the way they had, so I decided it was time to take a stand. The tension in the room was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. I stepped forward, my voice low and steady. Karen, enough is enough. I didn't need to raise my voice. The silence that had swallowed the room spoke louder than any shout. My gaze met hers, cold, unyielding, and filled with the weight of every lesson I learned in the Navy. I wasn't just a retired Navy SEAL anymore. I was a father, and my son's dignity was non-negotiable. Karen's face contorted into a sneer, and she responded in a tone laced with disdain. Oh, really? And what are you going to do about it, Mr. Hero? Is your military background supposed to make you some kind of savior? Her words dripped with condescension, as if my past service somehow diminished the reality of her entitlement. I could see the nerves in her eyes, a hint that deep down she wasn't used to being challenged. I leaned in, my voice firm yet controlled. No, Karen, my military training didn't make me a savior. It made me a protector. And I'm here to protect my son from your baseless cruelty. My words cut through the thick air of the community center, and something shifted among the crowd. It was like a ripple had been cast across a stagnant pond. Suddenly, whispers of agreement and murmurs of discontent began to rise. Karen, clearly rattled, attempted to regain control. This isn't a playground for your dramatics. We have rules, standards, and decorum. Your son is a part of this community, and you'll respect our way of life. Her voice, usually so commanding, now wavered under the collective weight of the crowd's silent judgment. A resident near the back, emboldened by what they had just witnessed, called out, "Maybe it's time the rules applied to everyone equally, Karen." The comment sent a wave of murmurs across the room, and I could see heads nodding in agreement. It was the first sign that I wasn't standing alone in this fight. I wasn't about to let Karen bulldoze over us with her entitled arrogance. Karen, your so-called standards have nothing to do with decency. They have everything to do with controlling people, with imposing your insecurities on those who don't deserve it. My tone was calm, yet every word was a measured blow. I recalled my time in active duty where every order was precise, every moment charged with purpose, and I used that precision here, letting every syllable count. She smirked, a laugh that didn't reach her eyes, and retorted, "You think you know everything because you served? This isn't about you or your son. It's about keeping our community pristine." I took a slow breath and stepped closer, letting the intensity of my gaze do the talking. "No, Karen. It's about respect. Something you seem to have forgotten entirely." The confrontation escalated quickly. The room was charged with an energy that I hadn't felt in years. Not in the heat of battle on foreign soil, but here at home, facing a battle of dignity and decency. My words resonated with those who had long suffered under Karen's rule. I saw faces light up with a mixture of relief and newfound courage. A few brave souls began speaking up. "I've had enough of Karen's tyranny," shouted one resident. Another, older gentleman, added, "We are a community, not your personal kingdom of judgment." Their voices merged with mine, forming a chorus that demanded change. Karen's eyes darted around, realizing the tide was turning against her. She faltered, her composure slipping like sand through her fingers. I continued, "You claim to maintain standards, but all you're doing is enforcing a hierarchy where you decide who's worthy. I'm not here to fight with fists. I've been trained to handle pressure. But let me be clear. I won't let your self-appointed authority dictate how we treat each other." The room grew even more charged, and even those who had remained silent were now leaning forward, fully invested in every word. It wasn't long before Karen's supporters began to murmur their dissent, and it became evident that she no longer held the uncontested sway she once did. The facade of perfection in our community was cracking, and every member present was ready to embrace a more inclusive, respectful way of living. My stance, though born from personal pain, had sparked a movement, a subtle yet powerful uprising against an abuse of power that had long been ignored. Karen tried to regain control one last time, her voice now trembling with a mix of desperation and fury. "This is an orderly meeting. If you can't follow the rules, you should leave." But her demand fell on deaf ears. The residents had finally seen through the veil of entitlement, and the moment of reckoning had arrived. I locked eyes with Karen, my voice unwavering. "The rules are meant to serve us all, not just a select few. Today, you've shown exactly what happens when entitlement goes unchecked. Consider this the beginning of change." As I finished, I could feel the eyes of the room, not with fear, but with hope and solidarity. In that electrifying moment, I realized that this public confrontation wasn't merely about a spat thrown in anger. It was a battle for the soul of our community. I stood there, embodying the spirit of every lesson I'd ever learned in service. Discipline, honor, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves respect. And as I faced Karen, surrounded by the supportive nods and murmurs of my neighbors, I knew that this was a fight we would win together. A fight to reclaim our community from the clutches of entitlement, one standing ovation at a time. In the aftermath of that explosive showdown, the air in our community wasn't just thick with tension. It was charged with the promise of change. The confrontation with Karen had ignited something within our neighborhood, and as the dust settled, the fallout was as inevitable as it was transformative. It all began the very next day when whispers of the previous night's events turned into open discussions in every corner of the neighborhood. It wasn't long before the HOA board could no longer ignore the outrage swirling around them. Karen's actions, once shrouded in the protection of community standards, were now under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Calls for accountability began to flood the board's email, and those same voices, once too timid to speak out, now demanded that the powers that be take decisive action. For the first time in years, the HOA was forced to confront the reality that its rules were being weaponized against those who couldn't defend themselves. I watched from the sidelines as Karen's carefully constructed facade started to crumble. Longtime residents, previously cowed into silence, began to openly support one another. I remember one neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a kindly, unassuming lady who had been a quiet bystander for too long, stepping forward at a special meeting and saying, "We can't allow someone to use these rules to spread hate. We deserve better." Her words resonated with everyone in that room, echoing the collective sentiment that entitlement had no place in our community. The board, now under immense pressure, initiated an internal review of the HOA's policies. It turned out that many of these standards were outdated, arbitrarily enforced, and, in Karen's case, deliberately twisted to justify her bullying. The investigation, fueled by countless testimonies and the undeniable evidence of what had transpired, led to a formal censure of Karen's actions. For the first time, our neighborhood's governing body acknowledged that power must be held accountable and that accountability could, in fact, lead to meaningful change. As the official reprimand was issued, the change was palpable. Karen was forced to step down from her role as the de facto enforcer of the HOA's rules, a position that had given her an unwarranted sense of superiority for far too long. In her place, a committee was formed, one that promised to involve residents more actively in the decision-making process. This new group was dedicated to fairness, transparency, and, most importantly, ensuring that every voice was heard, regardless of age, ability, or background. For me, however, this wasn't just a victory on a bureaucratic level, it was a deeply personal vindication. Standing up for my son wasn't about winning a battle against an entitled neighbor, it was about reclaiming the dignity and respect that every person deserves. I realized that my years in the Navy, the discipline and honor instilled in me, weren't just relics of a bygone era, they were the very principles that could transform a toxic environment into one where justice prevailed. But true change wasn't only reflected in official statements or policy updates. I could see it in the way people interacted with each other. The once hushed murmurs of discontent had blossomed into open conversations. Neighbors who had been isolated by fear of reprisal were now engaging with one another, sharing stories, and even laughing together, a sound that had been all too rare in our once divided community. I took it upon myself to facilitate some of these dialogues, organizing small neighborhood gatherings where we could discuss our issues openly and without judgment. These weren't formal meetings with agendas and minutes, they were casual get-togethers over coffee in backyards and park benches where the focus was on healing and moving forward. It was in these moments of camaraderie that I saw the real power of collective action. The simple act of coming together, of sharing our vulnerabilities and hopes, was nothing short of revolutionary. Even Karen, though now largely ostracized from the decision-making process, remained a part of our community, albeit in a diminished role. Her public apology, forced by the circumstances, was a far cry from genuine remorse. Yet it served as a stark reminder that even the most deeply entrenched systems of entitlement could be challenged. And while some might say that forgiveness in such cases is a tall order, I believe in the power of dialogue. I made it clear that while I would never forget what happened, I was also committed to ensuring that our community learned from it. It wasn't about letting someone off the hook, it was about making sure that the conditions that allowed such behavior to flourish were dismantled once and for all. As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of that fateful day continued to spread. The HOA, once a symbol of arbitrary power, was restructured to reflect the true spirit of community. Rules were revisited, biases were challenged, and a culture of empathy began to replace the old order of judgment and exclusion. I found myself no longer in a constant state of alert, but rather participating in a collective effort to build a neighborhood where every resident felt valued. Looking back, I realized that this journey was about more than just a single incident. It was about reclaiming our shared humanity and standing up for the inherent dignity of every person. Whether you come from a storied military background or have faced personal challenges that set you apart, the right to be treated with respect is universal. And in our little corner of the world, that hard-earned truth finally began to shine through the cracks of entitlement. In the end, justice wasn't delivered by force or violence, it was achieved through courage, unity, and a relentless commitment to doing what's right. And as I stand here, reflecting on the transformation of our community, I can't help but feel a deep, abiding hope for the future, a future where entitlement is met with accountability and every individual is given the respect they deserve.